Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Today's guest comes from an area of Canada that I have lived in. I love it. It has changed over the years since I actually lived there. And so we're going to ask our guest today just to talk a little bit about the ministry that he has in a small church in a place called Toronto. I was going to call it Saskatchewan, but it's not even close to Saskatchewan. This is Ontario. And so I'm going to let him just introduce himself, tell us a little bit about who he is, where he's come from, what his ministry journey has been. And then we'll get into a few questions as we talk about ministry in Toronto, in an urban small church, I guess I'll call it. So
Yes.
take it away, Steven.
Thank you, Ron. Steven Bakai, I'm pastor at Greenborough Community Church, and I've been there for about 12 years now. So it is something that I'm slowly learning uh,
Yes.
as it takes time. We are in an urban church. The church was founded in 1951, and it's the name of the church is an amalgamation of two communities to bridge a gap that was both theological and socioeconomic as well. So it was intentional that it was a community church that didn't emphasize the denominational aspects, which was at that time quite heavily done. And so the intention was that this church would be available for anyone within the Christian faith, regardless of the tradition. And in fact, those traditions are welcomed as seen as a source of strength um, and a deepening of faith. My own journey to Greenborough was global in a
Okay.
sense. I was born in Romania, in Transylvania. My ethnicity is Hungarian culture as well, and it's in a Baptist family. And our church was figuratively and literally the center of the town. So everything was and revolved around church. This is during the time that the Iron Curtain was still quite present. So if you were a follower of Christ, you were marked, and this was the cost of discipleship, and that also meant that the community was forged together
Hmm.
uh, through this experience. And then in 1989, family came to Canada. I attended the Hungarian diaspora church, the Baptist church in Toronto, and then I felt God calling me to pastoral ministry, but I thought it was within the Hungarian diaspora. So I went to Hungary, to Budapest, for my seminary training. Um, I came back after concluding there to be interim minister, but then God said, no, it's not your place. So I went and enrolled at IBTS, International Baptist Theological Seminary, which was currently at that time in Prague. And then I thought that God was uh, help me, or at least was leading me to serve in churches in Europe. But then we came back with my wife, and Greenborough was the church that God placed me in. I've been there here ever since.
So this is a very, how will I put this? A very different um, journey than perhaps as you planned along the way. I strategized and got things ready and said, "Hey, we're going to do this, going to do this," and then God kept calling you into something different.
Absolutely. That's been my experience where I plan something and God says, no, that's not what you're going to be doing. It's this one that so it's always a surprise, and it's always been a step ahead, kind of the reminiscent of Israel's crossing into the Jordan, where the Levites had to enter the water before it split. It wasn't everything was prepared ahead of them. They had to be courageous enough to step into the water, and then parted. So that's been my experience of God leading. It's always been a step ahead, never the long sort of
So
road.
that brings me to a question, and that is the current church that you're in, Greenborough, um, is in the midst of, I suppose you'd always say, over this last year, a change in the way that you approach how you're going to get things done, if you want to put it that way. Can you
Yeah.
describe a little bit about how that came about and what's happening?
So for us, it's been, I mean, when I got there, the church was, again, a small urban church. And I think the expectation was that, okay, we have this young pastor family, and now the church will be revitalized and grow. And it has a very long history, a rich history. And that was part of it. So there was a pressure that I felt
Mhm.
for this from the leadership. And I've been struggling. I was struggling with this to say, okay, what are we going to do? And obviously, there was all these church growth methods and leadership training. And I mean, there's a myriad of materials available and courses and persons saying, purchase my program and your church will grow and so forth.
Mhm.
And that pressure just increasingly kept weighing on me over and over again. And then as God always has led me, there's just this kind of Augustinian idea of the book that's in front of you and pick up and read. And I came upon a book by Pastor Tim Suttle called Shrink, and he talks about this. He's a pastor in a church in KC, and it just resonated so well. And there was a peace that I felt as I was devouring this book, and I did so quite quickly. And then from that, I prepared a course. I wrote to Pastor Suttle and told him of my intentions, and hopefully he won't take legal action against the course book based on his book. And then we went through it in the past year, and I felt a sense of levity, that something had lifted from the church because this kind of pressure to grow and and increase, and it just wasn't helpful for us. It was more of a burden than. And as we went through the course, which as I said, I loosely based off the book, I saw or experienced a sense within the church as well of just being free to be ourselves, and there's no shame in having a church that's small.
I
And
a
maybe
very a
God
very
doesn't
a
want.
very important point. I agree with.
Yeah, and also the story. I think that's something that's lost on us. This narrative approach that is to remember our story and how that story fits into the story of God. And kind of a Leslie Newbegin quote of the church's task is to tell and embody a story. And that's the
Mhm.
story of God. So how do we translate that? And so that's what we're figuring out now. I mean, I want to emphasize that this is not like another method. This isn't, that we're trying, and if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else. I think we want to embody this. This is going to be our way forward. I mentioned this to our church leadership as well, that I would like this to be the way that we would go forward, that whether, and it's not based on any metrics of success or whatever else. We don't know where God's leading us through this. It's
Mhm.
going to be a surprise. There's no guarantees. There's no, oh, you'll, 5-year plans scenarios or 3-year, seed time and whatever else that may be. This is us just being a church and living out the mission of God and participating in that mission. And God is the one that will determine where we go.
Well, I'm hearing a story that I've heard from a number of, I'll call them younger pastors. I'm one of those old ones. And but as I hear a number of younger pastors, they're saying the same thing, that I get into a church, I realize there's so much pressure because the people within the church, oftentimes with a good heritage and a great heritage, have had methods, have had practices, have had ways of doing things. And the pressure becomes so great that they lose through program, they lose people, And through constant, let's try something new, they lose the history of Christ and they just lose Jesus. Can you comment on a little bit of that? Because I'd love for those that'll be listening, just to, as a younger pastor, what you're finding and how you're finding that works.
Yeah, so as you correctly state and surmise as well that we do have a tendency to adopt models from business and corporate world where there is this kind of focus on pretty much the same. We want to have a vision, we want to have a mission, we want to have certain goals and those are all fine. There's nothing wrong inherently with that. But I don't think that's something that the church has to. I mean, I don't think Paul told the Corinthians, okay, you have to have a mission statement and a vision statement, and then all these programs initiated into it, and then you'll grow and so forth. The church was always, if you look at Acts, it just told a story. Peter preached the story of Jesus, and the church lived that story out, and that was the basis for their mission. It wasn't strategies, it wasn't any metrics that we have where it's how much is our financial scenarios and what will be what we can do. It just embodied the story and just lived that story out. The Anabaptist tradition is the same within Europe. They live that story out. They collectively discerned this is the way that we're going to do it. They were radical, at least called radical,
They were
because
radical, yes.
they said we're going to live this out fully. The Sermon on the Mount, we will live it out. There's no exceptions. There's no, we'll just pick and choose whichever parts we can do. I mean, they were absolutely committed to doing so. And of course, the result was that they were persecuted by both Catholic Church and Protestant churches.
Yes,
So, I
very
mean,
much so.
so that identity was based solely on Christ, as the center of the church, the place, the person whom you always align your life with. And I think as churches, at times we forget that and try models and methods that work in a corporate setting, absolutely, but and they can work in a church setting too. But the problem is that Christ is missing from all of this.
So as you think of this, is there a way that you've been able to discern? And I use the term discernment more not in program, method type things, but is there a way that you're discerning what comes next and where the church is headed?
Yeah, that's what we have is at least I've emphasized is the idea of communal discernment.
Okay.
So again, it comes into, and at times it is a contrast to this idea of, again, leadership training and training leaders. And again, I don't see that evidence of that, or when I read the Gospels, Jesus wasn't equipping the disciples in a sense of, you'll have to be leaders. It was discipling them. So it's always communal. And to emphasize that communal nature and a decentralized nature where there's not one person that sort of impresses a vision upon the church or a mission upon the church. It's what is God doing and how are we discerning that? But it's always in community to hear everyone's voice, which helps. And again, it goes back to this idea of what's our story, and just repeating that story, remembering that story, and passing that story on to the next generation.
So within Greenborough, let me ask you this. Can you give a quick 5 sentence, here's our story? Okay, I'll leave that, and then I've got a follow-up question I want to follow up with. But
Yeah, so for us, it's our story is, we started in this community when there was a need for it. We've been a community church, which means it's always been open, accessible, inviting. And as a small church, we are focused on relationships and being a family church. So our idea is that when you come in, you feel the warmth of a family. You don't have to have this a specific way of dressing, talking, believing anything. You come as you are. You're invited. You're welcomed into fellowship, and you're also, I don't want to say required, but the idea again within a small church is that you have a place, that you're not just sitting there enjoying it, but you're called to do something and be part of the church.
Yeah, as soon as you walk into the family, your family, you're not just
Exactly.
an outsider. Yeah.
Yeah.
So within this, I just add that you have mentioned to me that you're looking at trying to gather up some of the stories of the church and maybe put them into some kind of publication booklet or whatever. How are you going about that? And
So what I'm doing is I'm just collecting stories. I'm asking church members to write their stories down if they want to record the stories, and then I would put those stories into print, and then we would compile a kind of book or some sort of publication and make that available because that is something that we can share with our neighbors. To invite someone to church is an absolute hurdle that is seldom overcome. But if you share a story with them, they're they'll see, oh, this is what the church is doing, or this is what the church is about, because it is through those stories that people find their way into the church. They're sermons as much as, I mean, yes, that's my profession in a sense of preparing sermons, but it's not going to be the sermons that will decide whether someone will stay in a church. It's going to be the person that invited them, that relationship that has been built over years and years and years. And that's for us an emphasis is on that emphasis rather to to uh, to be relational rather than anything
so,
creedal or
yeah, so as you're talking about, reaching into the community with story, uh, are well, let me just ask the question. What type of things have you seen in this last year, two, three, four, that the church has reached into the community? How has that happened and what type of things
yes.
have happened?
So we want, one of the things is to make the church itself accessible and open it up for community events to take
Hmm.
place. One of the things that we've done in light of the past year that we went through with this booklet was the every last Sunday of the month we have an agape meal
Oh,
or
okay.
a table fellowship, and so we bring food and sit and we eat, and everyone in the community is invited to attend that. So we have requests for that, and now we just had in the past week whether we could expand on that to provide the or if that meal is open to those who are perhaps homeless or
Hmm.
not uh, able to whatever for whatever reasons. So that is something that we're planning on expanding and serving. And again, the idea is to invite other groups within our community to participate because it's not something we want to just do ourselves. We want a wider participation, other churches, other uh, nonprofit organizations to come and join us.
So if I were to be placed into Greenborough Baptist Church and walked out the front door and walked around the community, who would I see? What would I see? What type of a place is it?
So the neighborhood is quite there's a contrast because in terms of the riding itself, it is I think either the third or fourth lowest income
Oh, okay.
in so there's that, and then of course the Greenbrook Drive, which is where the church is on the corner of Keel and Greenbrook Drive. I mean the houses there are worth 2 million and change. So you have this quite a varied mix of social assisted housing near surrounding the church, and then you have those who, of course, have much more than they than they need.
Mhm.
And we participate in local events to bridge that gap and help those who are request groceries from us. So we have uh, those gift cards available for those who need it. And then, of course, we allow or we have work with partnerships with other organizations and schools as well to provide as much opportunities and just give back as much as possible. So yeah, there's a mix of ethnicities and cultures.
I find within many urban small churches that there is this um, such great diversity. No question about it. You're going to run across different languages as soon. Well, when I go to the grocery store here in Calgary, I'm trying to learn a few new languages, but there's so many of them around me, and and different perspectives and different ways of doing things. Um, and so coming into a community like that, some people are suggesting that bivocational, multivocational ministry, or I guess some people are calling it co-vocational, where anything that you do outside of the church is always in Christ's effort and for his sake. How that is done. Do you see some of that happening? Do you see how that would work?
Yes, yeah. So that is a reality that at times can be limiting in terms of what a pastor can do, just because you have to uh, be cognizant of your time and know which way or in which manner it would be used and what to prioritize, perhaps against what you may have. Um, I think there is an authenticity in that, so that the church again is not burdened financially, because that is part, obviously, of church life, and churches do struggle with that. And so, but I think there's so much human resource that can be tapped into and can be used by churches, where it's not so much the financial that should be focused upon, but what resources do we have, whether it is helping with putting together, let's say, a program where you fix small machines, and teach a child how to repair a toaster, or a teenager how to fix a lawnmower, or these types of and there's so many that have that skill, or someone who is a plumber and knows how to fix and teach. So there's so many things that churches can use that is not dependent on finance, but on relationships, and how to forge those relationships and forge bridges into the various communities. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily will have people coming to church. They may want to uh, be part of the workshop, but not the church. But the fact that the church has that ministry enables them to connect. And again, this is, just with the course book that we did, the advice of Pastor Tim Suttle to those in seminary, because he teaches at a Bible college as well, is to join a small church and be there about 10 years. So again, this is a long
Yes.
duration. When you're doing ministry, it's not 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. It may be God may bless you and you may have fruit within that time. But I think authentic relationships, just because it's so inauthentic today in our digital age, it requires more time. And there's a skepticism at the beginning of, well, you're just doing this to get something out of it.
Hmm. Which is an unfortunate thing that really good programs tend to market rather than bring relationship. And
Yes.
yeah.
And people are aware of that and suspicious as well. And so they're hesitant to fully commit, because they're waiting for you to either use it as a leverage, or from their own understanding of a transactional relationship.
Mhm. So there, in many ways, there's uh, as a person comes into leadership and ministry in a church, um, a number of younger people will come in with the idea that, wow, this is great. I'm going to help start the church, plant the church, move the church ahead. It's going to be a success. We're going to get bigger. Let me. If you had one piece of advice for a small church pastor, or leadership, what would that piece of advice be?
I would, my advice would be to be faithful instead of focusing on anything that has to do with growth or success or influence or effectiveness. I mean, none of those things were required of the churches, whether it was in Revelations or whether it was Paul writing to them. The metric, if we have to use this term, that is done in the New Testament is always faithfulness. Remain true, remain faithful to Christ, and the rest is essentially some of that which belongs to God. Because I don't say it's my church. I minister there, but Christ is the head of Greenborough, and it is His church, and He does with it whatever He wills. I mean, that I don't have the audacity to inform Christ what to do with the church, and so it's just to be faithful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think too often, yes, we do become people that have a program or at least want a good reputation or want something beyond Jesus.
Yes,
What
and
what
that has to be resisted. It has to be this very. Uh, I mean, I think it has to do with vulnerability. So if you're vulnerable, you will see that the ego and all these types of other things that may look good is absolutely in almost a visceral way is taken away by vulnerability when you're sitting with someone in a hospital bed, and realizing how fragile the human body is, and or those who will, their last moments, you're spending time with them, and the regret is never, oh, I wish I would have been more successful in life. I wish I would have had more in my bank account or whatever else. The regret is always, why did I work so much? Why didn't I spend more time with my family? I mean, that's, that grounding, that vulnerability is I think the key to sustaining, so that Jesus is the one that's always we point to, and then the Baptist's rule of, I must become less.
Yeah, yeah. The whole idea of humility, we could try and lift ourselves up, but that's not the one that we're to lift up.
No,
Yeah. And so humility is and vulnerability, as you say, are important contexts in which we have to live every day. For sure. Yeah.
and it has to be practiced, because our pride, and our ego tends to want things, and even if for the good, it's like, well, it would be good for our church to have these things, and look at all the good we can do if we have all of these, and we have to resist that, because again, I don't think that's what God is asked the church to do. It was we see enough of history that whenever the church was given authority and power, it did not do good.
Yeah.
It was just not. It ended up in a very, very bad place. And so to always be tempered against that, I think vulnerability and the idea of, again, cross of Christ, what Bonhoeffer states, when he says, when Christ bids a man to follow him, he bids him to die. I mean, that's
Well, I hate to say it, but I just looked at the clock. We got to quit already. Sorry.
yes. No,
I
no,
have
no, I
many more.
apologize.
I have many more questions, and yeah, I better stop, because if I start another question, we're going to go on for quite a while. But this has been great. I think this is very helpful for particularly pastors that have been brought up in a success oriented, and we need to return to a humility oriented and lifting Christ. But that's a whole other discussion for another day. But
Yes.
thank you very much, Stephen, for joining
Thank you,
us.
Ron. Thank you so much for your invitation, and for allowing me to have this conversation with you.